Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me at the conference here today. I'm really excited. Unlike the last presenter, I will be speaking English because I do not want to butcher the Finnish and what you all speak in Helsinki. Um, so fair warning, I do work for a vendor that is also sponsoring this. So just remember that as I talk through some of what I'm going to go through today. Um, what today's presentation is going to focus on is uh, a little bit behind the methodology that my team uses at Recorded Future, as well as some of our findings as it pertains to finding adversary infrastructure through internet scanning. And so what we're going to talk through today, we just have some high level stats here on the slide about the different things we track, how many things we track during the last year, and some of the trends that we saw. And we're really going to focus in on botnets in particular. So e-crime, sort of more organized malware families for us to use as a bit of a case study to show the value of data like this. As was said in the last presentation, this is only sort of one slice of data and is not the end all be all, but for me personally, it's something that I enjoy doing and enjoy talking about. So that's sort of the reason that we're bringing it here to you today. I just sort of went through the agenda without having the agenda slide up. But we're going to talk through the methods we use for internet scanning. I think we're going to really focus on a very low level sort of individual scanning methodology that we use to sort of test things out, only because we have a large sort of dispersed infrastructure at this point that it's unclear how proprietary it is. So we're only going to talk through stuff that you can do on your home computer. We'll get into the botnet and e-crime stuff and sort of other questions that you can begin to ask of this data set as you go about collecting it, whether that's through us or another security intelligence provider or yourself. And so a little bit about me. My name is Greg Lesnewich. I work at Recorded Future on a team within Recorded Future called the Insight Group. We are a Swedish founded company and have a pretty large presence in Gothenburg. I work on our research team, a couple of subdivisions under there, and mostly focused on malware analysis and tracking espionage-oriented actors. And so I spend a lot of time helping with some of, doing some of this internet scanning to find infrastructure that we believe is related to a given adversary and doing malware analysis. I've also been pretty active on Twitter talking about things like Yara and PCAP. So if those are fun things to you, hit me up and we can, have some fun with that stuff. These are the employer mandated slides that I have to give. So I will, we are an external vendor that focuses on, providing data to our clients to help better defend their networks. Unlike other sort of technologies like an IDS appliance that looks at internal network traffic or an AV company, we exist completely outside the network in sort of what we call the gray space. If we're talking about something red, it's going to tend to mean adversary, anywhere from the home computer that they use to log into their email, all the way up to sort of the amorphous hacker collective that is conducting the activity. The gray space is sort of where we're going to spend most of our time today, just talking through mostly IPv4 and where servers get stood up by adversaries. And then blue space is where most defensive effort gets spent. So the UEBA talk that we just had was all sort of internal blue space data in our view. So we're going to be mostly talking about things that are just sort of out there on the internet that we believe that we can verdict to better inform our clients' risk posture and risk exposure. Here are some stats about how good we are at doing those things to our clients. And this is sort of one piece of our corporate pie. We do a lot of other things. I just have that sort of thin little sliver up in the top right around threat and security and SecOps intelligence. The rest of it is sort of dispersed among all the other people on our teams. And we integrate everywhere. So part of the benefit of gathering the data that we're going to talk about is that you can plug this into a SIM tool, a SOAR tool, whatever you like, to better understand or posture against a specific threat or all the threats that we can gather through sort of threat intelligence means. So with that out of the way, we're just going to get into the internet scanning data. And so as we've sort of said, now the gray space is green because we needed slide cohesion. Most of what we're going to discuss today is going to be around what we call a malware controller. Unlike in the first presentation where command and control has, something, a military sort of meaning behind that parlance, this is effectively going to represent a server that a sample of malware calls back to. So it generates network traffic to talk to that certain server. And so for us, we can go out and find tons of those by mimicking the malware. Because we are not an AV company, we don't have visibility into all the targeted hosts or the victims where the malware is running. And so, for our best collection and best visibility, we want to look in the gray space in the operational infrastructure of the adversary. You can also do similar things like this for finding phishing domains. And, a lot of our red team vulnerability hunter and pen test friends like to use this sort of infrastructure space to identify weaknesses in their clients or in their adversaries, as well as sort of get an understanding of how many things of a certain technology on the internet. So there are a lot of different applications to what we will loosely call internet scan data. But for us, it's about finding things that we don't want talking to our corporate networks. And so we have two primary methods of doing this. We've been doing it since roughly 2017, which originally started in a partnership with Shodan, which is one of the big, I guess, 2 or 3, internet scanning companies that you can get a free account with and play with some of this data yourself. And so when we use a passive method, we are using something like a Shodan or a binary edge or a census, and using the data set that they're gathering and not interacting with the adversary's infrastructure to basically write signatures at the end of the day. That's what it ends up being, to find particular sets of servers for us to either further investigate or to funnel into a secondary enrichment and then tell our clients about it so that they can block and or detect it at their various tools inside of their security boundaries. And then we also have active methods, which are our own scanning that tend to emulate a specific malware infection to try and get the server to respond with either a payload or just a verification that it is what we think it is. And so inside of our recorded feature platform, you can run queries for show me all the new Cobalt Strike beacon C2s you've seen in the last 24 hours. And it all comes in sort of a very API-friendly data feed. And so it's no threat intel talk without talking about the diamond model. We use the diamond model really extensively here within the INSIC group at Recorded Future in our reporting, as well as in sort of understanding where to get data from. And so we're going to focus on the infrastructure side during this talk, predominantly around HTTP headers and their responses to particular probes, as well as SSL certificates seen on those hosts. Those tend to be the two primary ways that we see value from internet scanning. And so the value prop is that for anything that we're doing, it is work that our clients in their SOC teams and their DFIR or their TI teams don't have to do. And so last year we saw roughly 14,000 unique C2 servers once the numbers were all said and done, none of which we believe should be interacting with a corporate environment. But that being said, gathering all that data, verifying it, and getting into the right tools takes a lot of work. And so we sort of act as the data provider and liaison there to get that into your security tooling to help supplement things like the UEBA and give analysts time to pursue things like that, like the UEBA work, as well as building internal detections on their IDS or endpoint appliances, where we can sort of just plug data in elsewhere for things that we discover via the outside. It also has a ton of threat intel sort of implications from that, to get an understanding of, when a particular adversary is coming off of a break. Is there evidence of a ramp up of a particular group? We see this a lot with groups operating out of China, where they very much signal their intent through server creation prior to campaigns kicking off. And so it does become this, additional, very narrow, but very poignant data source for us to measure. And so why is doing this possible? And it's sort of the same thing. If any of you write scripts or write code with other members of your team, whether it's how they comment things out, how they build functions, how they do sort of anything under the sun, they tend to have patterns, right? Because we're human beings, humans write the software. They're going to be I think you can pick out among your colleagues who wrote something or who wrote a piece of code based on certain quirks. For adversaries and finding, malware or command and control infrastructure, the same thing applies. And so some of that is laziness, because they like to reuse the same tools or the same software that they put on the server to interact with the malware. And some of it is, just errors, like leaving around artifacts that can be found anytime you interact with the server. And so in the bottom right here, you can see just the command and control interface if you use Cobalt Strike. It's not anything, crazy, but there is a little command terminal window down at the bottom and a small little UI to show you where you are inside of a victim network. And because they reuse this Java application to view how they're interacting with the victim, we can fingerprint that Java application pretty roughly, filter that down into a sub data set for us to go out and scan, mimic a Cobalt Strike infection, and try and verify if we think that those servers are hosting those, are acting as C2s or not. And so this is also really easy with tools like Census and Shodan. You can see the recorded future logo behind me, but I would be remiss to say, go check out these tools if this is something you're into. There are a lot of detections and sort of ideas that people have published around finding these things, whether it's on Twitter or in open source. We have a few things out on it, so encourage you to check it out if this is something that is really giving you some interest. And so for those of you that act and operate inside of a network and do any sort of signaturing, such a session wouldn't be complete without PCAP. And so the benefit that we have when viewing a particular infection is that there tend to be a lot of similarities between the response that we would look for inside of an IDS, as well as the response that we would expect when interacting with the server externally. So in this instance, we can see that these are two different interactions with PowerShell Empire servers. The one on the left is from, I think, 2019, that the team at malwaretrafficanalysis.net provided out for us to use. It's freely provided to the internet, so it's not something that was just for my team, as well as one that we saw live, at least as of yesterday, or as of February 1st, open on DigitalOcean. And so you can see that there are a couple of commonalities among these cache control headers, the pragma, expires, and server headers. And so if you add all of these things together, they become eventually a pretty resilient method of identifying a technology on a server. And so effectively the same methods that you would use in writing an IDS signature, you can use in sort of a passive method to pull down likely candidates for out of Census or Shodan, or a different scanning data set. And so as an overview, I should have probably had this slide a little bit earlier, but we're here nonetheless. Of a typical infection flow is going to be, in most cases, this is going to avoid sort of all the exploit talk from something like a proxy shell or anything like that. But most cases that my team observes start with phishing. So a Word document, an EXE, or a PDF sent over email. User clicks on it, and after a couple of various different stages can happen, but an executable is then running on the victim host. That executable then beacons out to the command and control server, represented by this black box here on the right. And the controller can send commands back to the infection to gather data, to send additional malware there, or to interact with other things on the network. Most of the time, think about this as like an administrative prompt, but with their own sort of UI on that victim host as if they were inside the network. So for our methodology, we cut out that whole first part of the infection chain, and we just send packets as if we were this victim. There's a decent investment that happens here when you have to cycle machines or VPN nodes or user agents to really mimic the malware correctly, but also not get banned. It does tend to be a little bit of a cat and mouse game, but we can then send data to the server, because all that's really getting sent across the internet to things is data in the form of packets. And so through that emulation, we can then derive a response from the server to verify that it's up, and that it is the malware server that we think it is. And if this is something that you really like doing with botnets, you can also sort of sit around and repeatedly interact with the server to try and get it to send, to try and get it to send you a payload, which is always really good for finding new and emerging sort of modules of these different e-crime tools. What does this look like practically? It's a Python socket. At a low level, this is a script that I use pretty much every day. Not on the computer we're interacting with right now, but on a dirty computer, or what we call dirty computer disconnected from our corporate network, plugged into a couple of different VPNs. And all it does is, this is just an example with 8.8.8 plugged in, because I didn't want to necessarily give away, have someone attempting to browse to a given known or suspected command and control server. And all it is sending, opening a socket and sending a set of bytes. We use this method, particularly at a low level, to test things out, because with those bytes, you can emulate HTTP, HTTPS, or sort of anything across the spectrum of clear text protocols, which is really good, because then if it's just a TCP byte probe without sort of all the HTTP magic that comes along with it, it's easier to plug and play those things in as the array that we see down in the pay list variable. And so practically, what does that look like when it comes out network-wise? It turns into an HTTP request in this instance. And so this was the same beacon that we sent out to 8.8.8. And you can see that this looks like a normal web request. There are a couple things in here that we are using specially, including looking for this particular URI to try and connect to on the server, as well as sending a pretty distinct byte pattern inside of the HTTP data frame and body. And so this is for a family called Hyperbro that is believed to be a shared tool used by Chinese espionage operators. And so all it takes to verify some of those servers is a little bit of Python and inspecting one or two malware samples. The real catch there is then finding likely candidates through Shodan or other internet scanning, or scanning the whole internet yourself, and then the real effort comes through writing the parser to pull those things out and letting your computer hang for a little bit while it parses the data. So that, in a nutshell, is effectively how the scanning is done. So let's get into some of the data that we've seen over the last year. Some of you may know there was a big bad botnet for in 2018, 2019, and 2020 called Emotet. It was the worst. Part of that is because of how often it sent spam. Part of that is because how good it was at getting infections. But the long and the short of it, a number of different law enforcement entities took action against Emotet and reverse engineered its payload well enough to poison its update server and send out a fake update to other Emotet infections to then sinkhole the botnet and basically nullify all the infections that it had. So it was a very clever sort of method that law enforcement used. And this is sort of an important start to our story at the beginning of 2021, because this happened in January of last year in 2021. And so think the king of the market is suddenly no more. And so what we began to observe were a small set of smaller players that liked to use Emotet began looking to use get services elsewhere. We do like to think about the e-crime ecosystem as an economy. And so for every sort of service you can imagine, there is a vendor that is, or multiple vendors that are willing to provide their services. And so typically we see what we call distributors here on the left, like the TR distributor. Proofpoint has a name for one called TA551, Bazaar Call, and all these sort of different things that at the end of the day are just different spam senders. What's potent about them is that they spend a lot of time and effort engineering payloads or schemes to get victims to click on their alert documents. And so they spend this whole, have whole enterprises dedicated to getting users to click on documents or to allow access for something onto their computer to gain initial access. What then happens is the botnets that we're going to talk about, like Emotet, TrickBot, QuackBot, IcedID, and Dridex, will then get loaded by those different families. Those can then lead to other backdoors. We've made it this far in the presentation before I've said Cobalt Strike, which if any of you are blue team, red team, whatever, that you've heard of that software family before, as well as ransomware can all, sort of come at the end of these different chains, typically around whatever is the best way for the operator to monetize that particular infection. And so, a more small singular campaign level look at this is we have a distributor that sends all of this malicious spam. I guess all spam is somewhat malicious, but we don't see any of the botnet activity until this very last piece when the IcedID executable gets loaded. Everything else before that is what we call, sort of the distributor owns. And so they build the email, they build the LUR language inside of the email, they build the document and the code that exploits anything, as well as building the loader that then drops the botnet. And so while that, initial access may sound decently easy, there are a lot of different things getting engineered here that we want, to be able to detect and track. But because their whole enterprises are built around this, it makes it a little bit difficult to always catch these first infections. And at the end of the day, nothing monetary has been lost during this infection chain yet. And so while you may have software running on your computer that you don't want there, none of these things have exfiltrated data. All they've done is loaded software onto your computer that you don't want there. And so because these enterprises are so built around getting infections, there tends to be a bit of a cat and mouse game between defending against these sort of tools and operations with them successfully exploiting stuff. And so once the botnet is installed, the general flow of it is that they are pretty lightweight backdoors that load additional modules or tooling. And the big thing that we see with what we call botnets compared to everything else is that they beacon out to multiple servers and sort of come with a built-in configuration list of check if this server's up. If you don't get a connection back, try this one, try this one, try this one. This is a little bit different than more generic information stealers that will have a singular C2 associated with it. These tend to have a whole network of things that they call back to. Now, because of this, it is a lot of work to daily sit around, wait for spam, click on every spam email you get to then get a malware payload, run that malware payload, and then find all of those IP addresses. I'm lazy, so I would prefer to fingerprint the IP addresses and continuously scan for them rather than having to, face whatever sort of obfuscation method that the actors are using on a particular day. And so where our internet scanning comes in is all of these different servers that we see up here on the top right. All of them tend to have a very similar fingerprint. And so if we act like we're authenticating as a TrickBot infection, we can get them to send back, if not data, at least a verification that they are up, which for us is enough to tell our clients, hey, make sure that anything you see connected to the server, you investigate. This is just a little bit of what can happen after a botnet infection happens. If you follow the DFIR report on Twitter or Patreon, they put out some great reporting about how these actors then move laterally. We won't get too much into that today, but needed to include this for posterity reasons, because they are very, very adept in the last few years at landing and then moving laterally to whether it's have a ransom event across an entire network or steal data from the network. Their operations have gotten very, very slick at avoiding detection, and some of them, like Conti, even have a dedicated playbook that their teams run to try and get that data and that infection really well monetized. And so since we know that all of the botnet infection is going to beacon to attempt to talk to a number of different servers, and we know that those servers all have similar responses, what we can do is then go out and pretend like we are the first infection of the day every day and try and verify that servers are up or discover new ones. And so the benefit is that oftentimes, particularly with botnets, we can have what we call lead time, or time where we've observed the server and confirmed it's malicious prior to that server getting used by the adversary. I think that's pretty cool, but that could just be me being a nerd. And so there are other sort of like intelligence implications that we can pull out of this, like what we saw. So the king of the sort of spam and underground botnet, Emotet, that got taken down in January of last year, resurfaced in November. And so they came back. The benefit of this method is that it did give us a couple of days, or rather hours lead time, knowing, hey, a bunch of this infrastructure is back up. Does this mean we're going to be seeing spam shortly? Turns out it was. So it is a pretty good sort of indicator and early warning sort of tool set. And yeah, if there's just more data that we can use it to provide to our clients, we want to be able to do that. And so a few stats about the total numbers of different C2s that we've seen these actors or these botnet families rather use over the last year. At their peak, some of them were close to 500. The thing that really varies is across each sample, how many different command and control servers are in each one. And so Quackbot that you can see there has a huge number with 142 different IPs that could be referenced in each sample for it to communicate back with, compared to TrickBot or Emotet that only have 20, or way down to 2 or 3 with some of the other groups. What this actually shows us is with Quackbot, there's very little infrastructure recycling, and so they can, rely on these infections a little bit, or their infrastructure a little bit more soundly. TrickBot, on the other hand, we've seen a big jump in their infrastructure because they've split up their botnet a couple of times to give installation to some sectors of it, as well as continued recycling of the servers and finding new ones for them to use. We think because they saw Emotet get taken down, and there was a somewhat successful takedown of TrickBot infrastructure in October and September of 2020. So pulling all that back, we think that they've seen these takedown attempts and have responded by saying, okay, we're going to keep recycling stuff so quick that you can't keep up with us. We think our scanning method does a decent job of keeping up with it, but there are some botnet tracking wizards that can do some crazy stuff with looking at the malware and keeping up with it. So we like to think that we're just a player in that game. And so I think the notion of geographic-based blocking is gone with our forefathers, but I did want to reiterate with a couple of these findings that blocking by host country isn't always the best method, because for most of what we saw in 2021 for these C2s, most of them were hosted in the US. I'm an American. I don't feel very much shame in saying that we're not as good as we think we are. And I think that the amount of C2s that we saw last year sort of fulfills that, particularly around bots, but just highlighting that, hey, we can't necessarily rely on blocking Russian IP space to prevent e-crime threats, because on the inverse, if you block US-based stuff just based on the volume of data that travels through, whether it's AWS or Google or sort of any of those other major route providers, it can cause some major business issues. And by ASN, this one was a lot more dispersed, so we didn't see any real favored hosting providers. DigitalOcean is sort of at the top there because the benefit of this group or this botnet family called Iced ID was that they continue to use DigitalOcean over and over and over again. This isn't a commentary on DigitalOcean security practices, but it did make it easy for us to know where to go looking for new stuff time after time. But overall, there isn't really a preference or anything among these operators that says this is where you're going to find them most of the time. If we sort of pull back a little bit and look at not just the botnet data, but data wholesale, we can start to ask what we call like threat intelligence questions of the data. And so in the upper right, we can see two custom tools shared by Chinese espionage operators, one called PlugX and the other called Axiomatic Asymptote. And we can see that PlugX was originally sort of the in favor tool in May, June, and July of last year, but then saw these big spikes in axiomatic asymptote deployments. And we're not sure if that is because a certain group started using them, if someone just spun up a bunch of the servers to test something, but we can see, there are potential downstream effects of that, of saying, okay, well, we might be seeing more adoption of axiomatic asymptote compared to this old sort of favorite PlugX. The other benefit of this too is that if there are domains attached to any of those things, you can sort of get an idea of what the targeting may be. If it's something super general, like mimicking Gmail, it could just sort of be anything. But we saw last year with a group we track as Red Echo, they used a lot of things that emulated Indian critical infrastructure. So it did give a pretty good signal of what the targeting and intent was going to be for at least what they were trying to blend in as, not necessarily who they were targeting. Same thing at the bottom with looking at an open source tool called Sliver. We saw a big jump in November of 2020 with deployments of this. And so did something change? Did someone give a talk at a conference that really got people excited about this? Did our visibility improve is another sort of good question. Did the signature we write really improve at that point? And so there's a lot of questions that we can ask of this data, including how useful it is and how much we can verify. Is our knowing about X the truth, or is it more speaking to a bias in our data? A sort of similar thing along the speed route was, if you recall, the US and a big chunk of Western Europe was sort of up in arms last year with a group called Wizard Spider, or UNC 1878, using a ransomware family called Ryuk. Effectively, this was a really great case study for us to highlight with our friends at Mandiant, the use of internet scanning to find these sorts of things. And in this case, we can see in the chart on the right that they had a very heavily favored hosting provider that is based in Russia. I won't go into any further detail there, but effectively these servers all had a very unique fingerprint that you can see there in the top right, with the content length of 0 and a effectively spoofed server field. And so it gave us a really nice method to, daily run scans across this AS provider and pull out new servers as they're getting stood up, effectively showing the operational tempo of this particular group, and also telling our clients, hey, to prevent this sort of scary ransomware campaign that's going on, here's how you can get ahead of it. Through blocking and alerting and things like that. Not that just finding the servers is going to stop anything. Finally, a little bit more of an oddity case study that we've observed in the last couple of months has been a tool that we track as inertia law that has some overlaps with a cluster of North Korean activity called Kimsuki in open source. We do not call it that because that tends to sort of be an umbrella-ish term. But we've seen these servers acting as command and control servers for a tool called Appleseed, which is sort of I don't want to call it generic, but a pretty potent backdoor family. But what's funny about this is typically you see a very consolidated and compartmentalized operation where the phishing server to gather credentials is different from the download server that hosts the malware, which is also different from the command and control server that sends communications back and forth to the malware. In this case, they rolled all that into one, which is sort of strange for, from an analyst who tracks a lot of espionage stuff. I would anticipate that most of those things would be separated and distinct from each other. But in this case, we've seen this inertial law family. I have a typo on there, I apologize. We've seen this inertial law family hosting the phishing kit that is doing some victim and user fingerprinting when they visit the site. They're also hosting an administrative port for a tool called Tight VNC, which a number of DPRK operators have used. And so they're all sort of these like funky little threat actor mistakes that can happen when you are looking through this data and trying to gather it at scale. And so I think that it's a pretty fun and cool method to be using. And yeah, there's a ton of fun that you can have with it. There are also a ton of headaches that come along with it. And again, it's just one data set. It is not me going out and compromising every malware developer's machine so that we can find all of the malware. It tends to be a data set that is easily accessible though, because it doesn't require that you receive the spam. It doesn't require that you know how to reverse engineer a piece of malware. It tends to just require a free Shodan or Census account to get started. And so there are also just things that we can't find with this method. And so if those are things that you like doing as a red team operator, like using a domain fronting setup or extensive redirectors to keep researchers like me out of your tool set, I just want to acknowledge this isn't a way that we're going to find that. We do have other methods that we play with, but it's just a single data set and not something that we can say has fixed internet security once and for all. And so with that, I'm hoping to give us a little bit more time for questions. I will be sharing the slides, and there are a ton of other talks from our friends at Kaspersky, Mandiant, and PwC that have done some really cool work with doing internet scanning, Lastline and Carbon Black as well. If you want to go read those things or check out their YouTube videos where they get a lot more in depth about reverse engineering the malware or sort of different types of mistakes threat actors can make with their hosting, I encourage you to go check those things out. And yeah, that's all I had. With that, we can take any questions.
Yes, we do have a couple. Also, hello Discord and hello Twitch chat. As I mentioned in Discord, Nora had some issues with the net connection, so I'll be taking on with the questions. So you mentioned recognizing group by tool reuse. Apart from hacktivism, of course, there's that there. Are there still any types of like signatures groups might leave, or is it now all work, no play?
It is not as fun as the website compromising and defacement that some of the hacktivism groups used to use. This is much more what I'll call boring signaturing of different software, not necessarily a group leaving behind an autograph or a signature. There is a small exception for things that are freely available on GitHub that some of the community calls offensive security tooling, and those things do tend to leave a sort of what would you call it, like a signature graffiti tag might be a better term for it, that are really helpful to find their things, because they're trying to make sure that they're trying to help with defense, not necessarily just offense. So it's helpful for us because they leave their names or their Twitter handles in the HTML of the server, which is nice.
Right. So you don't find the script kiddie, but you know who made the tool that script kiddie uses.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Another one. How much confidence do you have on IOCs you provide? Or is there like a level of uncertainty? Like it might be a false positive.
Yeah. So when we first started this, we try and scale corporately. Anything that we don't have high confidence in, we are going to tag as suspicious, because it matches things that we know can be used maliciously. But say if it's a domain that, or an IP address that hosts 1,700 other domains on it, we're just going to flag that as suspicious, rather than telling our clients it's malicious and they should block it. It's more of a, hey, watch out for this, not a block this. The confidence question, I think, is a really good one. We're sort of always improving. And so one of the things that we've done is that all of the data that we can collect passively through Shodan, Census, and some other places, we verify ourselves through our own scanning framework. You saw some of my and my colleagues' very basic Python. We have some more dedicated engineers that can do some better stuff than that. We also go out and verify the servers that we detect daily. And so that increases the confidence that we are correct. We also don't include anything that is sort of research grade or in development. If we can't, verify that a piece of malware has connected to a server that looks like that before, it'll sort of live with our research team, and we'll try and write reporting on it to make sure that those things aren't visited by our clients, but it's definitely not something that is automatable every time. So we start with a high confidence bucket of data and then verify that through continuous scanning and emulation to make sure that we're not giving bad data to our clients.
Okay, and if you have any number, I think the next question is, how much bot activity does RFC in Finland?
In Finland, that's a good question. I can try and find out. If I can pull up this a CSV on my machine and try and get a quick count for it.
By all means, do. Yes. Yeah, everyone is interested. How much does this small but very connected country have for you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I will say that this will just be for Finland from the botnets. This won't include across all of our data set, only because that's just.
It would be quite a vast amount of data to go through.
Yeah. And my SQL isn't very good, so that's the other limitation.
I remember seeing in a previous presentation, like I was thinking, was it the one Magnus had, or was it another one I saw during a previous Helsinki Turkosek? But there have been like previous things where like some data as to amounts of attacks from or to Finland were shown.
This is great news. There is only one host that we saw in last year hosting a botnet in Finland.
So that's C2 server or something like that, or
botnet. This is just C2, yeah. So this isn't anything that is, and so that is one of 2,500. So pretty good.
Yeah, yay Finland. Okay. Last question. Slightly related, I guess. How about botnets that use, say, the onion router network? Or, of course, like don't say any secret matters, but do you have any insights on those? Like Atrax is the only one I can think of quickly, but I'm sure there are more.
Yeah, there are. They are really difficult to track with this method, and so unfortunately,
Yeah.
it's something that we can't emulate too well.
Yeah, maybe some of your researchers have something in the future for that.
I hope so.
Yeah. Okay, that was the last question. There was also Magnus said in chat in Discord, sorry, that ask Greg to share the slides with me, and I quickly share the links on the last slide here in chat. So can you send them to him?
I will do that right now, and I will throw all the links into the Discord as well for anyone interested, to at least to the YouTube talks, because I really like those.
Yeah, and also there was mention about the infrastructure report, the 2021 Adversary infrastructure report, and full spectrum cobalt strike detection. I actually looked at the first one before this, and yeah, it's really good.
So excellent.
Props to the entire company about that.
Yeah.
But while you send that to Magnus, I'd like to thank everyone for joining in the event, and of course it doesn't stop here. We have the after party in Discord. Oscar will open the tables voice channels shortly. Of course, Greg, all the other talkers, if they're still present, are welcome to join as well and answer any more questions people might have. And as for future events, well, I happen to be from Turkusek, and just today it was announced that, barring any unforeseen things, we will have a live event in Turku. So sorry to any Helsinki people adverse about Turku, but at least it's next to the train station in our normal venue of Sparkup. So you can can leave afterwards. But yeah, there will be a live event on the 10th of March, and find more information about it as time continues on Twitter and on the Cities at Mattermost. Again, that's another place to go to. You go on the Mattermost. You'll find a lot of people, a lot of information, a lot of good things there. But yeah, apart from that, yeah, you'll share the stuff to Magnus, and they will be there in stream chat. That's, I suppose, everything. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.